Imagine pouring 3 billion francs, a sum roughly equivalent to building the American Hoover Dam multiple times over, into a single immovable object. You lay down over 1.5 million cubic yards of concrete, forge 150,000 tons of steel, and dig a subterranean city stretching for hundreds of miles along your national border. You create the ultimate shield, a fortress complex so mathematically perfect and heavily armed that any frontal assault guarantees the complete annihilation of the attacking force. But what happens when you bolt your front door with a titanium vault lock and leave the back screen door wide open? Welcome back to the channel, where we dissect the triumphs, the technical specs, and the catastrophic blunders of military history. If you want to understand the brutal mechanics of warfare, from grand strategic doctrines down to the logistics of a frontline rifle squad, hit that subscribe button and join our ranks. Today, we are tearing into the Maginot Line, France's billion-dollar monument to the last war, and analyzing exactly how the German Wehrmacht turned the greatest engineering marvel of the 1930s into a massive concrete tomb. To understand why France buried a massive portion of its military budget in the dirt, we have to look at the blood-soaked mathematics of Mortin Muitam. France did not build the Maginot Line out of cowardice. They built it out of severe demographic exhaustion. During the First World War, the French Republic lost one million soldiers killed in action, with another high million men wounded. If you were a French male between the ages of 18 and 30 in Mortin-Muitam, you had a statistically terrifying probability of being dead or permanently maimed by the time the armistice was signed. The industrial heartland of northeastern France had been turned into a lunar landscape of artillery craters, shattered forests, and poison gas. The French High Command, led by conservative figures like Marshal Philippe Pétain, looked at the map and realized a stark geopolitical truth. Germany had a population of nearly 70 million people, while France had barely 40 million. In a straight war of attrition, a 1-to-1 casualty ratio meant the literal death of the French nation. They needed a massive force multiplier, a way to hold the eastern border with a fraction of the manpower, thereby freeing up their mobile infantry and armoured divisions to counterattack or manoeuvre. This is a classic defensive trap, heavily reminiscent of how the United States built the massive Endicott-board coastal forts in the late 19th century. The US spent millions fortifying harbors with massive disappearing guns to protect against enemy battleships, only to see the primary threat shift to carrier-based aircraft and submarines decades later. You prepare for the threat you know, and you pray the enemy obliges your strategy. The Maginot Line was not a single continuous wall like the Great Wall of China. It was a defense in depth, a sprawling network of mutually supporting strongpoints called ouvrages, which were essentially underground battleships anchored in the earth. Let us look at the technical specifications of these installations. A large gros ouvrage, like the famous Hackenberg complex, housed over 1,000 men, buried more than 100 feet underground, The surface exposed only reinforced concrete domes and retractable steel turrets, some up to 14 inches thick, capable of deflecting a direct hit from a Boncham mm heavy siege howitzer. Inside, it was a marvel of 1930s engineering and logistics. We are talking about positively pressurized interiors to keep out mustard and phosgene gas, electric narrow-gauge railways to transport artillery shells from the deep magazines to the gun blocks, and massive diesel generators that would not look out of place in a modern naval submarine. The primary armament consisted of twin mm gun turrets that could pop up, fire at a cyclic rate of 30 rounds per minute, and retract back into the earth before enemy artillery could lock onto their muzzle flash. The interlocking fields of fire were calculated for terrifying precision by French engineers, meaning any infantry trying to cross the barbed wire networks and anti-tank ditches would be caught in a crossfire of heavy machine guns firing 600 rounds per minute. It was an industrial meat grinder designed to make the Battle of Sedan look like a minor border skirmish. So if the Maginot Line was this impenetrable, how did the French lose their country in exactly 6 weeks? It comes down to a fatal flaw in strategic geometry. The fortified line covered the borders with Germany and Italy, but it stopped dead at the Ardennes forest and the Belgian border. Why would you build the greatest wall in history and stop halfway? Because extending the line to the English Channel would have meant building through the high water table of Flanders, which is essentially a giant swamp where heavy concrete sinks. Furthermore, extending the wall would have meant politically abandoning their neutral ally, Belgium, leaving them on the wrong side of the barricade. The French operational strategy, known as the Dial Plan, was to use the Maginot Line as a heavily armoured hinge. When the Germans attacked, the elite French mechanized armies and the British Expeditionary Force would swing forward into Belgium like a giant door, meeting the German spearheads on the flat plains where they could fight a controlled, methodical battle. But what if the enemy does not attack the hinge, and does not attack the edge of the door, but instead punches right through the thin wood in the middle? Let us look at the order of battle and the correlation of forces in Mai Mort Chin Bon Mui. On paper, the Allies held a distinct advantage in almost every metric. The French army boasted Motcham-Lu divisions, backed by the British Expeditionary Force, with Mu divisions, and the Belgian army with Haimihai divisions. The Germans fielded Motcham-Bami-Lam divisions, but they heavily relied on horse-drawn logistics for their infantry. Yes, while the history books and documentaries love to show endless footage of German tanks rolling forward, the reality is that the German army in Mortnin Chinchambonmui used over 2 million horses to move their artillery and supplies. The true disparity on the Western Front was not in raw numbers, but in doctrine and the application of modern technology. Take the armoured forces, for example. The French actually possessed more tanks than the Germans, fielding roughly Ba-Hund-Haitam armoured vehicles compared to the German count of Hai-Bontam. And French tanks were heavily armoured monsters for their time. The pride of the French armoured corps, the Char B1 bis, weighed barmi mot tons, wielding a Bami Lam mm howitzer in the hull and a high-velocity Bonmi Bay mm gun in the turret. Its frontal armour was Saumi millimeters thick of cast steel. The standard German anti-tank gun of the time, the Bami Bay mm Papa K Bami Sau, was nicknamed the Door Knocker by German crews because its armour-piercing shells literally bounced off the hull of the Char B1. But the French tank had a fatal ergonomic flaw that negated its heavy armour. It featured a one-man turret. The French tank commander was expected to load the main gun, aim the gun, fire the gun, observe the battlefield, and direct his driver, all while looking through tiny, restricted vision slits. Furthermore, the vast majority of French tanks lacked two-way radios. They communicated using signal flags, a method completely useless in the smoke, dust, and chaos of a modern mechanized battlefield. Now look at the primary German medium tank, the Panzer III. It only weighed high tons and had a much smaller Bami Bay mm main gun. Its armour was only Bami millimeters thick, meaning a French Bonmi Bay mm shell could punch right through it at combat ranges. But the Panzer III had a three-man turret. It housed a dedicated commander, a gunner and a loader. The German tank commander did not have to wrestle with loading heavy artillery shells. He just stood in his cupola, observed the battlefield with a Bacham Saumi degree view, and directed his crew via an internal intercom system. And crucially, every single German tank was equipped with a two-way radio receiver and transmitter. This allowed German panzer divisions to operate as a cohesive swarm, reacting to the fluid battlefield at the speed of voice communication, while the French armoured units operated at the speed of a man waving a coloured flag out of a hatch. This technological gap in communications perfectly mirrored the command structure of the two nations. The French operated on a doctrine called bataille conduite, or methodical battle. It was a rigidly centralized system where orders flowed incredibly slowly from the top down. The French commander-in-chief, General Maurice Gamelin, commanded the entire theatre of operations from the Château de Vincennes outside Paris. Incredibly, this supreme headquarters famously had 0 radio transmitters. Gamelin relied on civilian telephone lines and motorcycle couriers to receive reports and issue orders. If a French frontline unit spotted a German breakthrough, it could take up to bon mitam hours for the information to reach Gamelin, be processed by his staff, and for an order to come back down to the front. In the mechanized warfare of Motin-Chin Bonmi, bon mitam hours was an absolute eternity. The Germans, conversely, utilized Auftragstaktik, or mission-type tactics. German High Command gave their subordinates a clear objective and the resources to achieve it, leaving the exact tactical method up to the officer on the ground. This meant a German captain commanding a panzer company could call in a Stuka dive bomber strike, or change his axis of advance to exploit a weak point without asking a general 50 miles in the rear for permission. This clash of military doctrines is heavily reminiscent of the early days of the American Civil War. Union generals like George McClellan built massive, beautifully equipped, and heavily armed forces, but moved them with agonizing caution, constantly waiting for perfect orders, perfect weather, and perfect logistics. Meanwhile, Confederate commanders like Stonewall Jackson utilized speed, decentralized command, and rapid flanking maneuvers to paralyze and defeat much larger Union forces. In Mortain-Chinchambon-Me, the French military apparatus was acting like McClellan, and the German mechanized forces under aggressive commanders like Heinz Guderian were about to execute a strategic flanking maneuver on a continental scale. The industrial output of both nations had been running red-hot for years leading up to this moment. The massive Krupp factories in the Ruhr Valley were churning out Panzer chassis and artillery barrels around the clock, while the Renault and Hotchkiss plants in France were casting heavy steel turrets and assembling thousands of armored vehicles. The forces were finally deployed and waiting. The Maginot Line sat silent and lethal, its elite fortress garrisons waiting in their subterranean concrete tubes, staring through optical periscopes across the Rhine River and into the German Saarland. To the north, the heavily armed French mechanized divisions idled their engines, ready to sprint into Belgium the moment the first German boot crossed the border. The strategic trap was set perfectly for a bloody replay of Mortain-Chinchambon. But German General Erich von Manstein had looked at the map. He had heavily analyzed the French deployment patterns, and he had fixed his gaze on a rugged, heavily forested region in southern Belgium known as the Ardennes. This was an area of dense woods, steep ravines, and narrow dirt roads that the French High Command had officially classified as completely impassable to modern armoured formations. The countdown to the greatest military shock of the 20th century had reached 0. Let us see exactly how a ghost division moves through an impenetrable forest. On the morning of May-Mere, Mortain-Chinchambon-Me, the dense canopy of the Ardennes forest began to choke on the thick, black exhaust of diesel and gasoline engines. Over 41,000 German vehicles, including 1,200 Panzers, were crammed bumper to bumper on narrow dirt logging trails and winding mountain roads. This was Army Group A, commanded by General Erich von Manstein, executing the audacious Sichelschnitt, or sickle-cut plan. To understand the sheer scale of this logistical tightrope, imagine trying to drive the entire population and vehicle fleet of a mid-sized American city through the Appalachian Mountains using only single-lane dirt paths, all while maintaining absolute radio silence. The traffic jam stretched for over 100 miles, reaching all the way back across the German border to the Rhine River. If a single squadron of French reconnaissance planes had flown over this specific 50-square-mile patch of trees, the entire German war machine could have been obliterated by heavy bombers, while it was trapped in a colossal gridlock. How do you hide an armoured armada of that magnitude from the greatest military power in Europe? You do not hide it. You rely entirely on the enemy's institutional arrogance. The French High Command, sitting in their chateaux outside Paris, had mathematically calculated that moving an armoured army through the Ardennes would take a minimum of 15 days, giving them ample time to redeploy their forces. They assumed the Germans would have to stop, build massive logistical depots, clear the forests, and drag heavy artillery through the mud just like they did in Mortnin-Chincham-Mui-Born. But the German Wehrmacht of Mortnin-Chincham-Born-Mui was not the imperial army of Mortnin-Mui-Born. They did not bring heavy, horse-drawn siege artillery to crack the river defences. They brought their artillery in the sky. This brings us to the most terrifying psychological weapon of the early Second World War, the Junkers-Due Tam Mai Bay Stuka dive bomber. The Stuka was not a particularly fast or well-armoured aircraft, but it was designed for one specific, devastating purpose, which was pinpoint vertical delivery of high explosives. When a Stuka pilot initiated a dive, he would roll the aircraft completely inverted at 10,000 feet, pull back on the stick, and plummet toward the earth at a near 90-degree angle. This extreme angle of attack eliminated the horizontal trajectory of the bomb, making it as accurate as a sniper rifle. As the aircraft accelerated past 350 miles per hour, wind-driven sirens attached to the landing gear struts, known as the Jericho trumpets, would begin to howl. This produced a mechanical, shrieking scream that grew exponentially louder as the plane hurtled toward the ground. The pilot would release his 500-pound bomb at an altitude of just 1,500 feet, because pulling out of such a steep dive generated up to 6 Gs of force, instantly knocking the pilot unconscious as the blood drained from his brain. German engineers installed an automated pull-up mechanism that engaged the moment the bomb was dropped, flying the plane back up to a safe altitude while the pilot regained his vision. On Mai Miriba, just 3 days after entering the forest, the spearhead of General Heinz Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps reached the eastern bank of the Meuse River at the French city of Sedan. Sedan was the critical hinge of the French defensive line, but it was not protected by the subterranean fortresses of the Maginot Line. Because it sat behind the supposedly impassable Ardennes, it was defended by General André Corrap's 9th Army, a force largely comprised of B-class reservists, older men in their 30s and 40s with obsolete weapons and poor morale. Their defences consisted of hastily poured concrete pillboxes and shallow trenches strung along the western bank of the river. The Meuse at this point was a formidable obstacle, roughly 70 yards wide with a fast-moving current, backed by the heavily wooded heights of Marfay, which gave the French a commanding view of the German approach. Standard military doctrine dictated that Guderian should halt his armour, wait weeks for the German infantry and heavy artillery to catch up, and prepare a massive, methodical bombardment before attempting to cross the river. This is exactly what the Union Army did during the American Civil War at the Battle of Fredericksau. Skin. General Ambrose Burnside halted his massive army at the Rappahannock River, waiting weeks for pontoon bridges to arrive, which gave Confederate General Robert E. Lee ample time to fortify the high ground of Marye's Heights. When the Union finally crossed, They were slaughtered in one of the most lopsided defeats in American military history. Guderian was intimately familiar with military history, and he had no intention of repeating Burnside's fatal mistake. He was not going to wait for his heavy artillery. He picked up his radio and called in the Luftwaffe. At tam-sham hours on Mai Mui Ba, the skies over Sedan darkened. In the most concentrated use of tactical air power in history up to that point, over 1,000 German aircraft, including nearly 400 Stukas, began a continuous, rolling bombardment of the French positions. This was not a random carpet bombing. It was a surgically orchestrated suppression mission. For 8 agonizing hours, the Stukas plummeted from the sky in relays. The shrieking of the Jericho trumpets echoed off the river valley, creating a deafening, inescapable wall of noise. The 500-pound bombs smashed into the concrete pillboxes, severing telephone lines, burying trenches, and shattering the eardrums of the French defenders. The physical damage was severe, but the psychological damage was catastrophic. The French reservists of the 55th Infantry Division, trapped in their bunkers, began to experience a collective nervous breakdown. They called it le cafard, a complete psychological collapse characterized by uncontrollable shaking, weeping, and a desperate urge to flee underground. By Motinam hours, the French artillery batteries located miles behind the river, completely untouched by the bombing, but terrified by the relentless noise and rumours of German tanks, simply abandoned their Mucham Nummi Lum millimeter heavy guns and fled to the rear. What happens when you hold the high ground? But the troops manning the guns simply lose their minds and walk away. The door swings wide open. At Mortain Sow hours, the bombing abruptly shifted to the rear areas, and the elite German Sturmpionier, the combat engineers of the Grossdeutschland Infantry Regiment, sprinted to the water's edge. They did not have heavy bridging equipment yet. They carried inflatable rubber assault rafts, paddling furiously under the cover of heavy machine gun fire from the German bank. They crossed the 70 yards of water. As they hit the western bank, they utilized the Flammenwerfer Barmi Lum, a portable flamethrower capable of shooting a jet of burning oil up to 80 feet. The engineers blasted fire through the firing slits of the surviving French pillboxes, incinerating the defenders and clearing the immediate riverbank. Within hours, German bridging units arrived and began constructing a 16-ton capacity pontoon bridge under the cover of darkness. By the morning of Mai Mi Bone, the first Panzer IIIs and IVs were rolling across the Meuse River. The impenetrable Ardennes had been breached, and the river line was broken in exactly 4 days. The French High Command finally realized the magnitude of the disaster, and the agonizingly slow gears of their centralized command structure began to turn. They ordered their elite armored reserves to counterattack and seal the breach at Sedan. This culminated in the Battle of Stonne, a small, heavily forested ridge south of Sedan that would become known as the Verdun of Mortinchin-Bonmuy. Between Mai Mi Lam and Mai Mi Bay, this tiny village changed hands 17 times in some of the most brutal close-quarters armoured combat of the entire war. This is where the technological superiority of French armor violently collided with German tactical agility. On the morning of May Missau, a single French Char B1 bis heavy tank, commanded by Captain Pierre Billotte and named Ure, rolled into the burning main street of Stonne. Lurking in the smoke was an entire column of German Panzer I's and Panzer IVs from the 8th Panzer Regiment. Billotte did not hesitate. He drove his 31-ton monster directly into the German formation. The German tanks opened fire at point-blank range. Their Bami Bay mm tungsten core armor-piercing rounds, striking the French tank with deafening clangs. But the Char B1 bis had 60 mm of cast steel frontal armor. Angled to maximize deflection, the German shells simply shattered or bounced off into the rubble. Billotte calmly traversed his turret and began systematically executing the German armor. He fired his high-velocity Bon-Mi Bay mm turret gun to punch through the thin 30 mm armor of the Panzer II's, while his driver aimed the massive Bay Milli Lum mm hull-mounted howitzer, blasting the heavier Panzer IVs into burning scrap metal. In a span of 20 minutes, Captain Billotte single-handedly destroyed 13 German tanks and 2 anti-tank guns. When he finally reversed out of the village, his tank was inspected by mechanics. The hull of the Ure had taken 140 direct hits from German anti-tank fire. Not a single round had penetrated the armor. If a single heavy tank can absorb over 100 direct hits and wipe out an entire armored company, how does that side still lose the battle and the war? Because warfare at the strategic level is not a series of heroic one-on-one duels. It is a massive logistical and communicative nervous system. The French fought like lions at Stonne, but their counterattacks were localized, uncoordinated, and launched piecemeal. While Captain Billotte was destroying tanks in a single village, Heinz Guderian was utilizing his SDKFZ, High Cham Nammimort Beshk A Bar Command Half-Track, to orchestrate a theater-wide mechanized ballet. This armored vehicle was essentially a mobile radio station, equipped with a heavy frame antenna and an Enigma cipher machine. Guderian did not sit 50 miles behind the lines in a chateau like his French counterparts. He rode right behind the lead tanks, observing the battlefield through his binoculars, listening to the encrypted radio traffic, and issuing verbal orders that instantly shifted the axis of advance for tens of thousands of men. When the French heavily defended Stonne, Guderian simply ordered the bulk of his panzer divisions to bypass the ridge entirely, leaving the heavy French tanks stranded on a hill with no targets, no fuel and no infantry support. This ruthless prioritization of speed over security completely defied conventional military logic. The German High Command, terrified that Guderian was extending his supply lines too far, repeatedly ordered him to halt and wait for the infantry to secure his flanks. Guderian flatly ignored them, or conveniently claimed his radios were malfunctioning. This aggressive, insubordinate drive is heavily reminiscent of American General William Tecumseh Sherman's March to the Sea in Mort Canin Tam Saumidu. Sherman cut himself off from his traditional supply bases in Atlanta, ignored the standard military doctrine of protecting his rear, and drove a dagger directly through the heart of Georgia. He realized that the psychological shock of an unstoppable army moving freely through the enemy's rear areas would paralyze the opposing command structure. Guderian applied this exact same psychological warfare, but at 50 miles per hour. The logistical reality of moving armored divisions at this speed was a nightmare of fuel consumption. A standard Panzer III achieved barely 1 mile to the gallon when driving off-road or fighting through urban rubble. To keep the spearhead moving, the Germans relied on a brilliantly simple piece of engineering, the Wehrmachtskanister, known today as the Jerrycan. This 5.3-gallon stamped steel container was a masterpiece of industrial design. It had 3 handles so a single soldier could carry 2 full cans or 4 empty ones. It had a cam-locking lid that required no tools to open, and an internal breather tube that allowed the fuel to pour smoothly without glugging or spilling. In contrast, the British and French used flimsy, soldered tin cans that frequently burst in transit, leaking up to 30% of their highly flammable aviation and tank fuel into the dirt before it ever reached the front lines. The Jerrycan allowed German motorized supply columns to rapidly refuel the Panzers right on the roadside, bypassing destroyed gas stations and keeping the Blitzkrieg rolling day and night. By the 3rd week of May, the unthinkable had happened. The French mechanized armies and the British Expeditionary Force had swung into Belgium, exactly as they had planned. But Guderian's panzers had sliced completely behind them, severing their supply lines, their communication wires, and their only route of retreat back to central France. The Maginot Line, the billion-dollar fortress of concrete and steel, was completely intact. Its underground trains were still running, its massive guns were fully loaded, and its garrisons were ready for a frontal assault that would never come. They were holding the strongest shield in human history, but the sword was already perfectly positioned at the back of their neck. The race to the English Channel was on, and the beaches of Dunkirk were about to become the last desperate hope for the survival of the Western Allies. As the British Expeditionary Force and the remnants of the French mobile armies bled out on the beaches of Dunkirk, desperately waiting for naval evacuation, a surreal and terrifying situation was unfolding hundreds of miles to the east. Over 400,000 elite French fortress troops were still sitting inside the subterranean complexes of the Maginot Line. Their massive diesel generators were humming perfectly. Their ammunition magazines were stacked to the ceiling with high-explosive artillery shells, and their positively pressurized ventilation systems were cleanly filtering the air. They were fully prepared to fight the apocalyptic, multi-year siege they had spent a decade training for. But the German war machine did not oblige them with a frontal assault. Instead, General Heinz Guderian's panzers had completely severed the logistical umbilical cord connecting the Maginot Line to the rest of France. The greatest fortress in human history was now a heavily armed island completely surrounded by a sea of German mechanized infantry. How do you defeat an impregnable subterranean city without sacrificing hundreds of thousands of infantrymen in a frontal assault? You simply walk around to the back door and knock with high-velocity, armor-piercing artillery. The Maginot Line was a masterpiece of unidirectional engineering. Its massive concrete slopes, interlocking fields of fire, and 14-inch thick steel retractable turrets were all mathematically angled to obliterate an attack coming from the east, across the German border. The French engineers, constrained by budgets, and the belief that the mobile army would protect their rear, constructed the western-facing entrances of these fortresses with significantly lighter defences. The rear access doors, designed for supply trains and reinforcement columns, were protected by thinner concrete and lighter machine gun cupolas. German Army Group C, commanded by General Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, realized this fatal geometric flaw. As the French nation collapsed behind the line, German combat engineers and specialized artillery units began meticulously dismantling the Maginot fortresses from the rear. This is where the technological terror of the German tam-tam centimeter, Flak Bamisau, entered the ground war. Originally designed as a heavy anti-aircraft gun to shoot down high-altitude bombers, German commanders quickly realized that its extreme muzzle velocity of nearly 2,700 feet per second made it the deadliest anti-tank and bunker-busting weapon on the battlefield. German artillery crews would drag these massive 7-ton guns through the captured French rear echelon, setting them up just a few hundred yards behind the isolated French ouvrages. They aimed the high-magnification optical sights directly at the rear steel doors and the concrete ventilation shafts of the French bunkers. When an tam-tam millimeter tungsten core armor-piercing shell struck the lighter rear armor of a French turret, it did not just punch a hole. The kinetic energy transfer caused massive internal spalling, sending hundreds of razor-sharp steel shards ricocheting around the confined interior of the gunroom at supersonic speeds, instantly liquefying the French gun crews. But even with the tam-tam millimeter guns pounding the rear entrances, many of the heavy French fortresses, like Ouvrage Hackenberg and Ouvrage Schönenburg, simply refused to die. The French fortress troops, known as the Écrevisses des Remparts, or the fortress crabs, fought with a terrifying, cold-blooded efficiency. When German infantry attempted to storm the rear supply entrances, the French simply rotated their massive Bayme mm twin turret guns as far backward as their mechanical traverse limits would allow, and dropped thousands of high-explosive airburst shells directly onto their own rear access roads. The Germans brought up massive Boncham-Jaime millimeter heavy siege mortars, lobbing 2-ton projectiles high into the atmosphere to crash down directly onto the reinforced concrete roofs of the fortresses. The ground shook violently. The lights flickered, but the 12-foot-thick, poured concrete held. The Maginot Line was absorbing punishment that would have levelled any major city on Earth, and its guns kept firing. This catastrophic disconnect between tactical success and strategic failure mirrors exactly what happened to the American military at the fortress of Corregidor in Mortin Chin Chin Chum Bon Mi Hai. The United States had spent millions of dollars turning the island of Corregidor in Manila Bay into an impregnable coastal fortress. It was armed with massive 14-inch disappearing guns, heavily fortified concrete bunkers, and subterranean tunnel networks designed to completely annihilate any Japanese naval fleet attempting to enter the bay. But the Japanese military simply ignored the sea approach. They landed on the lightly defended beaches of the Lingayen Gulf, marched their infantry down the Bataan Peninsula, and set up their heavy siege artillery on the high ground of Mariveles, directly behind Corregidor. The massive American coastal guns were designed to fire armor-piercing shells at battleships out at sea. They had limited rearward traverse, and they lacked the high-explosive anti-personnel ammunition needed to fight a land battle. Just like the Maginot Line, the American fortress was mathematically perfect for a threat that never materialized, and completely helpless against a dynamic enemy that simply walked around to the back door. To understand how the French High Command allowed their entire nation to be flanked, we must dissect the multidimensional failures of intelligence, logistics, and political will. The French military intelligence agency, the Deuxième Bureau, was not blind. In the months leading up to the invasion, French aerial reconnaissance pilots repeatedly flew over the German Eifel region bordering the supposedly impassable Ardennes forest. They took thousands of high-resolution photographs showing massive logistical depots being built, pontoon bridging equipment being stockpiled, and hundreds of miles of new dirt roads being cut through the trees. The intelligence officers correctly analyzed this data and sent urgent reports to the Supreme Headquarters, warning that a massive German mechanized thrust was preparing to strike through the Ardennes. But the French Commander-in-Chief, General Maurice Gamelin, suffered from a terminal case of cognitive dissonance. He had spent his entire career and billions of francs building a defensive doctrine predicated on the Germans attacking the Maginot Line or the flat plains of Belgium. Because the intelligence reports did not fit his preconceived strategic reality, he simply dismissed them as elaborate German decoys. This catastrophic failure of intelligence interpretation is heavily reminiscent of the American experience leading up to the Tet Offensive in Vietnam in Mortin Chin Sao Mi Tam. American military intelligence had captured thousands of pages of Viet Cong documents, intercepted enemy radio traffic, and interrogated prisoners, who all explicitly detailed a massive, coordinated nationwide assault on urban centers during the Tet holiday. But the American command structure, heavily fixated on their own statistical metrics of body counts, and the belief that the enemy was incapable of launching such a complex, multi-city operation, dismissed the overwhelming evidence. They convinced themselves the enemy build-up was merely a diversion for a conventional siege at the marine base of Khe Sanh. When you build a rigid intellectual framework for how a war is supposed to be fought, you become completely blind to the war that is actually happening right in front of you. The economic and logistical burden of the Maginot Line also played a massive, hidden role in the collapse of the French field army. The sheer volume of raw materials required to build the line was staggering. We are talking about 1.5 million cubic yards of concrete and 150,000 tons of high-grade steel. Every single franc, every ton of steel and every hour of industrial labor poured into the stationary fortresses of the Maginot Line was a resource explicitly stolen from the modernization of the French mobile army. While the fortress troops sat in climate-controlled underground barracks with the electric kitchens and motorized rail cars, the French infantry divisions in the field lacked sufficient anti-tank guns. Their radios were obsolete or non-existent, and the French Air Force was desperately short of modern fighter aircraft. The Maginot Line was not just a physical wall. It was an economic black hole that consumed the industrial capacity to fight a modern war of maneuver. The political climate of the French Third Republic in the 1930s compounded this military paralysis. France was a deeply divided, politically toxic nation. The extreme left-wing communist factions and the extreme right-wing fascist sympathizers hated each other far more than they feared the rising threat of Adolf Hitler across the border. Government cabinets collapsed every few months, leading to a complete lack of long-term strategic coherence. Prime Minister Paul Reynaud desperately wanted to fire General Gamelin and modernize the army's doctrine. But Gamelin had deep political connections and could not be removed without collapsing the fragile coalition government. When your political apparatus is entirely consumed by internal factional warfare, the military is inevitably left adrift, clinging to outdated doctrines because nobody has the political capital required to force a painful modernization. The Maginot Line became a psychological crutch for a fractured nation, a comforting illusion of security that allowed the politicians to avoid making the hard, expensive choices required to build a truly modern mechanized military. On June High, Motnin Chin Bon Mui, the French government officially signed an armistice with Nazi Germany, surrendering the nation. But inside the Maginot Line, the war was still going on. The vast majority of the heavy fortresses had never been breached. Their armor was intact, their guns were still loaded, and their crews were still standing at their battle stations, eagerly waiting to slaughter any German infantryman foolish enough to step into their kill zones. When the French High Command transmitted the official order to surrender via radio, many of the fortress commanders flatly refused to believe it. They assumed it was an elaborate German psychological warfare trick, a fake broadcast designed to make them abandon their invincible bunkers. It took days of intense negotiations, and in some cases, French generals physically driving to the fortresses under a flag of truce to convince the écrivisses de rempart that the war was truly over. The psychological devastation of that moment is almost impossible to comprehend. Imagine spending your entire military career training inside the most technologically advanced, heavily armed fortress ever constructed, You have absorbed thousands of tons of enemy artillery fire without taking a single casualty. Your weapons are perfectly maintained. Your morale is unbreakable, and you hold the absolute tactical high ground. And then a man in a pristine uniform arrives from Paris and tells you to walk out of your invincible steel bunker. Hand your loaded rifle to a German soldier and march into a prisoner of war camp for the next 5 years. All because the generals 50 miles behind you forgot to guard the forest. The garrison of Schonenburg, which had fired over 17,000 heavy artillery shells during the brief campaign, and successfully repelled every single German assault, finally marched out of their subterranean city on July Mortnin Chin Bon Mui. They locked the heavy steel doors behind them, undefeated in combat, yet utterly destroyed by grand strategy. The ultimate legacy of the Maginot Line is heavily misunderstood by popular history. It is frequently mocked as a colossal failure of French engineering, a useless wall that the Germans simply drove around. But from a purely military engineering standpoint, the Maginot Line did exactly what it was designed to do. It was built to prevent a sudden, massive frontal assault on the French industrial heartland, and it succeeded perfectly. It forced the German High Command to funnel their entire mechanized invasion force through the narrow, highly dangerous bottleneck of the Ardennes forest and into the plains of Belgium. The Maginot Line successfully created the exact strategic choke point the French military planners had asked for. The catastrophic failure of Mortain-Chincham-Bonne-Mur was not the concrete wall. The failure was the French Mobile Army's complete inability to win the maneuver battle that the wall had initiated. You do not build an anvil without also forging a hammer. The French built the greatest, heaviest anvil in human history, but their armoured hammer was too slow, too poorly commanded, and too technologically disjointed to strike the fatal blow when the German army placed its head on the block. The Maginot Line stands today as a chilling monument to the danger of the static mindset. In warfare, business or national survival, building a perfect defense against yesterday's threat is the fastest way to guarantee your annihilation by tomorrow's innovation. You can pour 3 billion francs into the dirt, you can forge the thickest steel on earth, and you can hide in a mathematically perfect subterranean fortress. But if you cannot adapt to the speed of a changing world, you are just digging a very expensive grave. As we analyze the ghosts of the Ardennes and the silent concrete domes of the Maginot Line, we are reminded of a brutal historical truth. Technology changes the speed of war, but human arrogance is always the anchor that sinks the ship. Are you building a wall to protect your future, or are you just hiding from the reality of the present? Let me know your tactical assessment in the comments below. Which fatal flaw do you believe was the absolute primary reason for the rapid collapse of the French military in Mortain-Chincham-Bonne-Mur? Was it A, the rigid top-down, slow communication of the French centralized command structure? Was it B, the technological failure of French tanks operating with one-man turrets and no radios? Or was it C, the catastrophic intelligence failure to recognize the massive German buildup in the Ardennes forest? Drop your vote and your reasoning in the comments. Hit that subscribe button to join our tactical network, and stay vigilant.